Good evening and welcome to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. We're pleased to have a great audience of students, faculty, alumni, and other interested people joining us tonight. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as the interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute. The Taubman Center seeks to impact American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. This year, we've been placing special emphasis on the 2020 national elections, the events which followed, and now seeking perspective on the new administration and the new Congress. With the nation facing an unprecedented array of crises, a pandemic, an economic crisis, a racial justice reckoning, and the danger of domestic terrorism, we're struggling to come to grips with the future of our democracy. The Taubman Center is committed to better understanding the challenges and the options going forward. Toward that goal, tonight, we present the 21st in our series of events. We have as our guest someone with a unique perspective on these issues and others, drawn from a long career as one of the nation's leading public opinion researchers and communication strategist, an advisor to many of our nation's leaders. Mark Mellman is a past president of the American Association of Political Consultants and CEO of the Mellman Group. Among the leaders with whom Mark has worked are former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and current House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. He's helped guide the campaigns of 29 U.S. senators, 10 governors, over 24 members of Congress, and numerous state and local officials. In addition, the Mellman Group's clients include Fortune 500 companies and important public interest groups. Internationally, Mark has successfully advised political leaders in Israel, Colombia, and Albania. In recognition of the Mellman Group's years of unparalleled accuracy, they've been named Pollster of the Year 3 times by the American Association of Political Consultants. Nate Silver, the editor-in-chief of the influential 538 polling website, cited the Mellman Group as the most accurate campaign polling firm in the United States. Mark is a graduate of Princeton University and holds a graduate degree from Yale, where he taught in the political science department. He served as a consultant to CBS News and as a presidential debate analyst for PBS and the Wall Street Journal. Mark's op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal, among others, and he writes an influential weekly column for The Hill, a newspaper for and about Congress. And Doonesbury has called Mark the Prince of Polling. So we've got the Prince here tonight. My conversation tonight with Mark will last approximately until 8 o'clock, after which we'll take questions from the audience. You may enter questions through the Q&A box on Zoom, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the program. Please keep them short and to the point. I'll convey as many of these questions to Mark as we have time for. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. It's also being live streamed on YouTube. Now it's a great honor for me to introduce my friend, Mark Mellman. Welcome to Brown, Mark.
Thank you so much, Rich, and thanks for that very kind introduction. It was obviously written by my late mother, but I appreciate it.
Well, she knows you best.
She did.
Uh, well, let's start here. I think I know the answer to this question, but the question is polling broken?
Well, polling is in difficult straits, but it's still extremely useful. There's no question about that. Polling has a lot of problems. When you go to the hospital, God forbid, they talk about heroic measures. And heroic measures means really that chances are, there's a good chance that if they take these measures, the patient's going to die. But the patient will surely die if they don't take the heroic measures. That's sort of the place we're in with polling. We have to take heroic measures to make polls accurate. But there are heroic measures we can take. We take them, and usually we come out about right. But it does take heroic measures these days for a lot of reasons, which we can go into, because there are some fundamental problems. But the reality is the polls are still a pretty good predictor of what people are going to do. In fact, a much better predictor than lots of other approaches, lots of other methods.
It seems every 4 years in the wake of presidential elections, we have a crisis of confidence in political polling. This was certainly true in 2016, but a careful look suggests that the polling on the national popular vote anyway was quite accurate. On average, public polls suggested that Hillary Clinton would win by 3 percentage points. She won by 2. But what was the problem with getting the Electoral College right?
Well, that's a great question. And look, the same thing is true this time in 2020, which is to say, if you look at the average of the polls, they had Biden ahead by about 7%, a little over 7%. He won by about 4.5%. That's pretty darn close. And so, as I say, by and large, polls can be pretty accurate, still are pretty accurate by and large. But when you get down to, well, first of all, we have to realize what we're measuring. That is to say, when we measure we take a national poll, we're measuring the national popular vote, and we do not elect presidents in this country via the national popular vote. So it's an interesting statistic, it's an interesting artifact, but that's what it is, interesting. It is not how we elect presidents. We elect presidents based on the Electoral College, and so people look at polls across individual states. And the truth is, most of the polls that are done in individual states are done by local media outlets. They're done on the cheap because, as we all know, local media outlets suffer greatly these days from budget cuts. They're turning loose reporters, but they're also cutting back on their other budgets. So the heroic measures that one has to take are expensive to undertake, to do those polls right. They tend to do them less well, and that's a problem. Second, though, even if you look at the states, if you average the polls together in individual states in this last time, the polls predicted the winner in every state but 2. Georgia, the polls gave Trump a 1-point average. Biden actually won by less than 1 point. So the difference was less than 2 points, just over a point. The other one was in Florida. The polling gave Biden an advantage of less than a point. Trump won by 3 points. That's about a little over a 3-point, almost a 4-point difference. That's pretty significant as these things go. But that's the only state that was significantly off if you look at those polling averages. But if you get underneath this even more deeply, which I've tried to do, there's a lot of reasons for this. We can go into some of the other explanations. But one of the things that turns out to be true is if you look through these states, what you find is that almost all these polls, again, the averages, pegged the Democratic percentage of the vote exactly right. Where they were a little bit off was on the Republican side, on the Trump side. There are a number of reasons that could be, and we have to figure out which are the right reasons. My own view, honestly, is it has to do with partisanship, and we can talk more about this. But I think what you find is that the reality is that at the end of the race, there are a number of people who are Republicans who are conflicted, weren't sure they really wanted to vote for Trump, but in the end, they followed the partisan guidelines, if you will, that were in their brains. They followed the tribal and sectarian instincts in their minds and went with their party. And so Donald Trump ended up with the highest percentage of Republican vote of any Republican candidate in the history of polling. Ronald Reagan had a landslide in 1980 across this country, won every state but one. But the reality is Donald Trump did better among Republican voters than Ronald Reagan did by only a point, but still, you get the point.
I'm curious, you know, a lot of people uh, uh, seem to think something that they call the shy Trump voter was a factor. I'm wondering what your feeling is about that.
Yeah, there's really no evidence for that. It's an interesting idea, but there's no evidence of that because the truth is you had the same problem in Senate races. We haven't gone through all the House races yet. There's a lot of them and a lot of polling. But if you go through the Senate races, it's exactly the same issue. The Democratic number almost exact. The Republican number underestimated. Um, there are some other, besides just partisanship, there's some other possible explanations here. For example, it's not so much shy Trump voters as it is what we call differential non-response. That is, if you were a Republican this time around, for some reasons that were political, for some reasons that are more sociological, you may have been less willing to take a survey at this point or at that point in the electoral cycle. And so that's not a shy Trump voter. That's not someone saying, gee, I hate to admit that I'm voting for Trump. It's just a Republican who's saying, you know what, I'm not so anxious to take a survey because I think we're not doing so well. I'm for whatever reasons. Or culturally, because Trump has told me that surveys are bad and polls are bad and they're all wrong. So I don't want to participate in them. And just as I may not want to vote in Georgia in the second time because it's all rigged. So lots of different reasons you can have differential non-response. That's a different kind of explanation. There's several others. There's going to be a lot of studying done over the course of the next year or so when we have really complete data to give us a better sense of what the real reason was. But the basic fact is the polls weren't that far off, all in all, and they did get the Democratic number right. They got the Republican number wrong.
One of the difficult things for pollsters to predict, I think, is turnout. And does the emphasis that campaigns now put on turning out their base complicate things for polling?
It complicates things in a number of ways. First, and it goes back to the broader question we're discussing, and anyone who's taken a psychology course has probably learned this, the link between attitudes and behavior is pretty tenuous, It's sort of remarkable that we can ask people how they're going to vote and they actually end up voting mostly that way. Because if you ask people if they're going to buy a computer or a car over the course of the next year, those numbers aren't very accurate, aren't very predictive. Those correlations are at about a 0.3 level. These correlations are at about a 0.99, 98, 97 level. Mm-hmm. So people are not very good predictors of their own behavior. They're better with elections than they are with other things. But turnout is one aspect of that. People are not very good at predicting their turnout. A lot of pollsters have had this, what I call likely voter fetish. They focused on these people who are repeat voters. But the reality is that's a relatively small proportion of the electorate. When we talk about someone being a likely voter, we're making a probability statement. And I'm making this up, but let's just say that if someone who's a likely voter has an 80% chance of turning out. Well, that means out of every 100, 20 of them aren't going to show up. And let's say an unlikely voter is going to have only a 20% chance of voting, which means out of every 120 will show up and vote. And so if you have a world of 200 people, 100 unlikely and 100 likely, you're going to end up with 80 likely voters and 20 unlikely voters. You're not going to just end up with likely voters. So when you take out those people, and those likely voters are determined sometimes by what people say, for some pollsters, they say I'm going to vote or not. Sometimes they're determined by past participation. Well, we know you voted only once out of the last 3 elections, so we're going to count you as an unlikely voter and not talk to you. This likely voter fetish is really a problem because it distorts the electorate. One wants to replicate the likely electorate, and one doesn't want a poll of likely voters because no electorate's ever been made up just of likely voters.
It always amazed me that most politicians think they know from their internal polling down to about 1/10 of a point what their vote will be on election day, but at the same time, they can tell you in great detail the impact it will have on them, whether it's a sunny day or a rainy day.
Yes, exactly. But we did have, we had 20 million more people vote, a little more than 20 million vote in 2020 than voted in 2016. That group of people may not have been adequately polled. Again, we'll have a much better sense of that when we have access to voter files, and a lot of that data will help us illuminate that question.
Because you're looking for likely voters, and if you're doing that by asking about past behavior, these voters voting for the first time wouldn't seem to be very likely.
Exactly right. So, and that's why, in our firm, we don't use those likely voter models. We focus on the likely electorate, but most pollsters use some version of a likely voter screen, and that can mess you up badly.
I've noticed that Pew Research reports that response rates that pollsters are experiencing have dropped from about 37% in 1997 to about 6% today. So what's the future of telephone-based polling?
Well, there's no question response rates have dropped, and that is a huge problem. In the 1990s and 1980s, when they were dropping, once upon a time they were in the 40s and even 50%, but have dropped dramatically. The truth is, what matters to make a poll accurate is that everybody has an equal probability of being contacted. And as long as the people you talk to are not systematically different from the people you don't talk to, you don't have a problem. So response rates in and of themselves are not that big of an issue. And so when response rates went from 50 to 30, there was really no degradation in accuracy. But now when we're talking about very small response rates, the likelihood of getting a sample that does diverge in important ways from the electorate as a whole increases substantially. So that's why some of the heroic measures are necessary.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we've moved to, for example, is away from just pure telephone polling. Well, go back half step. There was a time, you remember, I remember, most people may not on this call, but when everyone had a landline, that was the only phone you had. And when it rang, you picked it up because you had no idea who was calling until you picked it up and answered it. And so we had most people answering their phones and being willing to talk to us. That eventually we moved to mobile. And all of a sudden, you couldn't reach people on landlines. You had to reach them mobily, and you could get them while they were driving their car, walking down the street, any number of places. So that became more difficult. Then people stopped answering those mobile phones. And now most people don't answer a call from someone they don't know, and they know who's calling. So all of that has changed. We had answering machines in between. All of that has changed the dynamics here. So what we've learned is that you have to use multi-method. You have to be multimodal. That is to say, we reach some people by calling them on their landlines. There are still people that have them. We reach some people by calling them on their cell phones. Again, people still do that. We reach some people by sending them a text and asking them to take a poll online that they can go to from the text. And sometimes we offer some rewards for doing that. So we have mixed those different methods together. And by mixing them together, we get a much better sample. Because what we found is each of those methods on their own produce a pretty biased sample. Put them together, you have a pretty good sample.
So even on the online portion of the polling, you're able to produce a random sample?
Yes, well, more or less random. Again, we have a whole problem with randomness, but yes, because we're not. Again, there are different ways of doing online polling. There are people who have a panel. Now, people go to people and say, "Would you raise your hand and take surveys for us?" And people, yes, I'll be willing to take a survey for you. That's not what and that's a problem because those are clearly, it is not most people who will say, "Yes, I want to take surveys voluntarily for the next year." That is a different kind of person. But what we're doing is texting people and say, "Hey, right now you have an opportunity. If you take this poll, you can win a prize, you can get some cash, whatever it may be." And we do get significant numbers of people. But as I say, each of those samples on their own, the people we just reach on the cell, the people we just reach on the landline, the people we just reach online, each of those samples in and of itself is biased. You put them together, you get a much less biased sample.
In your view, is there value to what polling aggregators do? That is, building models based on a broad range of polls and sometimes other factors?
Well, yes. So there are two kinds of aggregators. There's the simple averagers who just take whatever they get and average it together.
Mm-hmm.
Example of that is Real Clear Politics, for example, that website. On the other hand, you have people like Nate Silver, you mentioned before, who does all kinds of statistical work to those polls to try and discount them for various factors or increase their value for various reasons. And the truth is, there's not that much difference most of the time between the two. There's some. A lot of that difference is that there are some, Nate Silver doesn't accept some polls at all. Real Clear Politics doesn't accept some polls at all. And so the end result is they're using slightly different databases. That accounts for most of the difference. But yes, there is value in that because the truth is, again, one of the things we've learned, used to be, I'll give you an example. We did, you mentioned Harry Reid was a client of ours for many years. In 2010, he was running for re-election in Nevada. Every single poll done, and it was the majority leader. It was a very important race. Lots of polling was done by lots of different people. Every single poll that was done in the state had him losing except ours. And we had him winning by exactly the margin that he won by, which was wonderful. But the reality is, you could look at all the polls and average them together, and you'd end up with the wrong answer because, and it was really this likely voter problem that tripped people up in that case. Today, though, if you average together a bunch of polls, more likely than not, you're going to get a better answer than if you just looked at each one individually, because each of those polls is telling you something about the electorate. And again, averaging them together usually gives you a better response, a more accurate indicator. Sometimes that's not the case, but you never know that in advance.
So shifting a little bit, usually the first midterm election is a problem for the party of newly elected presidents. So what's your early sense about the 2022 midterms?
Well, people often think that pollsters can predict the future. We're pretty good at predicting the present. That does put us one step above historians who confine themselves to predicting the past. But we're not so good at predicting the future. So I can't really be certain about this. What I can tell you is, Rich, is exactly what you were suggesting, which is there's a history here. And the history is that in the midterms, the party in power in the White House does not do so well, as you suggested. But as they say on the stock brokerage commercials, past results are not an indication of future returns. So we can't be sure about this. We know we're going to have some dramatic differences. So, for example, presumably, God knows we hope that we have a much better economy in 2022 than we did in 2020. We're going to have, we certainly hope, a much COVID under control in 2022, which it certainly was not in 2020. So people are going to look around, I think, in 2022 and say, you know what, things are really better today than they were 2 years ago. And that's something that will inure to the benefit of Democrats. So you have that going we have that going for us. By the same token, you have a country that is very deeply divided. You have a Democratic Party, excuse me, that has majorities, obviously for the White House, for the Senate, for the House, but they rest on very, very, very narrow grounds. We had about a 45,000, or 50-50 in the Senate because of about a 45,000 vote margin in Georgia. If you look at 5 districts, if you look at the House majority, it rests on about 37,000 votes in 5 districts around the country. So in total, there's about 37,000 votes. So the reality is it's a very narrow hold, and each race is going to be very, very important. And how those individual races shape up, how the environment looks, a lot of ways to guess at it.
Oh, and so far we have 4 open seats for retiring senators, and they're all Republicans.
That's right. And, couple of them, several of them are really in pretty competitive states. North Carolina certainly has been competitive. Pennsylvania has been very, very competitive. It was in the presidential race. It was in recent Senate races. So those are going to be very, very important races. And we have some other retirements as well. Alabama, probably not one we're going to win, even though there's a retiring Republican there. My neighbor, in fact, down the street.
And there's some likely competitive races for seats that Democrats now hold as well.
There could well be. Could well be. I mean, obviously, we have Reverend Warnock. Senator Warnock will be running again in Georgia. He was just filling out part of a term, so he's up in 2 years. The same thing is true with Senator Mark Kelly in Arizona. So they will have not had a lot of time in office, and they'll be facing some serious opposition, I'm sure.
From what you see, from where you sit, how big a political factor is Donald Trump going forward?
Donald Trump still seems to be the dominant figure in American politics in many ways. Certainly for Republicans, he is the most influential figure by far. You see this in all kinds of ways. You see it in the behavior, the obsequious behavior. if I dare say, of Republicans in the House and the Senate. People who criticize him one day are going to lick his boots the next day. People like Nikki Haley, who quit his cabinet, was very critical of some of his behavior, asked to see him in Mar-a-Lago. He refused. I can sort of understand why, to tell you the truth, from his perspective. But the reality is Republicans are continuing to pay fealty to Donald Trump. You also see it in the poll data. It's way too early. I mean, we're 4 years away from the next presidential election, but it just gives you a sense when over half of the Republican voters are saying they would vote for Donald Trump over any of the other Republican candidates. It gives you a sense of how powerful a figure he is in the Republican Party. And indeed, you have a significant number of Republicans who say they are more Trumpsters or Trump supporters than they are Republicans. That's not most Republicans, but it's a very substantial portion of Republicans. So Trump has a lot of power, a lot of influence in that Republican Party. For Democrats, obviously, it's a negative kind of power, but still, the most important thing for Democrats these days is opposing Trump and the people that enabled him and the policies that he's put in place. Calling something a Trump policy is a sure way to get Democrats to oppose it.
Along those lines, how big a wedge has Mitch McConnell opened up?
Well, exactly. I mean, Mitch McConnell is one of the people who playing a sort of strange game. On the one hand, he's been very critical of Trump's behavior on January 6th and in the events leading up to January 6th, very critical of his continuing efforts to lie about the election. But at the same time, he voted to acquit him in the Senate impeachment trial. He really he could have done something very different. He could have led the Republican caucus to convict Donald Trump and to prevent him from running for office again. And honestly, that would have solved a huge problem for the Republican Party. But McConnell did not have the guts to do that. He made up some story, non-historical story about the precedents in U.S. history for impeaching people who've left office, completely at variance with reality. But in any event, that is an important problem because Trump has said, I'm going to go be involved in Republican primaries, potentially against Senate candidates that haven't been the kind of candidates I want, people that pay homage to me. So it's going to be a potentially significant problem for McConnell and the Republicans. It's one of the advantages that we have going into 2022.
The Biden administration, it's of course it's very, very early, is likely to live or die by the politics of COVID. One recent poll showed 58% of respondents approving of the way he's handling the pandemic. Do you have any kind of handle on that?
Well, I think all of the polls really, there's been a number of them, all of them agree that people like the job that Joe Biden is doing so far. That's very important. Many more than you would expect based on partisanship, the partisan division in the country. So that's a real positive. People like the way he's dealing with COVID. That is an important positive. But look, reality matters here and matters a lot. So if COVID gets under control in a reasonable time frame, I think there's going to be a lot of political rewards for Joe Biden and accolades for him to reap. On the other hand, if for whatever reason it doesn't go well, that battle doesn't go well, there'll be a cost to pay. But so far, I think he's doing an extremely good job, and people are noticing.
Yeah, his broad overall approval numbers have been pretty good. Certainly, considerably higher than Donald Trump ever reached during his administration. But yet, the Biden numbers, not that much unlike Obama and Clinton and George Bush, have been, well, they're impacted. They're impacted by how partisan the political environment is that we live in now.
Exactly.
My question is, are we seeing an end to presidential honeymoon periods, do you think?
Well, that's a great question. Let's put it this way. They don't last as long as they used to. But we really have moved from an era in general, not just at the presidential level, but from an era of candidate-centered politics to an era of party-centered politics, which is to say that as soon as you're identified, as soon as you are the Democrat or the Republican, there's a lot of people who don't like you, no matter what you're doing, no matter how things are going. That's just going to be the fact. And so, as you rightly say, the Republicans are defecting earlier and more substantially from approving of Biden than they did in earlier terms. But that has nothing to do with Joe Biden. It has nothing to do with the realities. It has to do with the partisan nature of our politics. And it's why, we used to be able to, you remember this in the Senate, as do I, we used to have 4 Democratic senators from the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. Nobody could imagine such a thing today. But we had candidates that were great candidates, great people that voters in their state got to know and said, okay, I'm not a Democrat, they are, but they do great things. They have wonderful personalities. They care about me. They deliver for my state. Anymore, that just doesn't matter. If you're a Democrat, you can't really win in the Dakotas. That's just the simple fact of the matter. And that's played itself out in different ways at different levels in different states as well.
Yeah, in fact, in general, it's become extremely difficult to win a Senate race in a state where the presidential candidate is the winning presidential candidate is of not your own party, the other party.
That's right. And we also have very few mixed states. That is, where you have one Democrat, one Republican. And if you look at the states where you do have that, it tends to be states that are very evenly balanced. For example, Pennsylvania, we were just talking about, that was an exceptionally close presidential race. We have one Democrat, one Republican. The Republicans are retiring. We'll see what happens in 2022. It's a good opportunity for Democrats. But even those mixed seats, we used to have a lot of them. We have very, very few of them today.
Right. Exactly. Will the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which is so important, it has really shaken all of us, and especially those of us that have spent a lot of time in the Capitol. But do you think, given the way that issues turn over these days, that that experience will reverberate long enough to have a real impact on future election?
Well, I think it's going to reverberate for a long time. I think it's going to reverberate for a long time because it was so traumatic for the country, because it was a truly unique situation. As everyone now knows, the last time the Capitol was attacked was in 1814 during the War of 1812. And so it's a very rare and dramatic fact. So that in and of itself is important. But the reality is we're going to continue to see trials. We will begin to see trials of the people who participated in that attack. We're going to see a commission now that's going to be put together to investigate that attack. So we'll understand better how it happened, the details of that. But that attack is going to continue to be on the front pages for a variety of reasons for many, many months to come. So I think it will continue to reverberate. The reality, though, is that too is interpreted in a partisan way. Now there are certainly more Republicans. There's certainly most Republicans now oppose the attack, no question about it. But they look at it in a different way. Most Republicans see it was a nonviolent protest that went bad. Most Democrats look at it and see this was a violent insurrection designed to overthrow the government, or at least ground the government to a halt. So very different perceptions of this event based on partisanship, but the event itself, I think, is going to continue to reverberate in very significant ways.
Well, only 10 Republicans in the House voted to impeach Donald Trump. 7 Senate Republicans voted to convict him. Is it even possible to convict a president in an impeachment trial?
Well, by Mitch McConnell's logic, who said his argument was we've never convicted a president who was not in office. By his logic, we shouldn't be able to convict anyone because we've never convicted a president in impeachment. So I guess all presidents are off scot-free now because we never have convicted one. it's obviously very difficult. It was designed to be a difficult step. It is a difficult step. But the reality is no president has ever been convicted at an impeachment trial. So that, and the fact that Donald Trump undermined so many of the democratic norms, as well as the rules, but the norms in particular that keep the guardrails that keep our democracy in place, and did so without much of an apparent consequence. And the fact is, Donald Trump got more votes and a higher percentage of the vote in 2020 than he got in 2016. Now, obviously, Joe Biden did even better relative to Hillary Clinton, but not by a lot. So after all that happened, Donald Trump still got more votes, higher percentage than he had before. Republicans were still able to win a lot of House races and Senate races. So I think it's going to be much more difficult to enforce these guardrails, enforce these norms, enforce these rules that keep our democracy going. We count on the reasonableness of the person occupying the office. Joe Biden respects democracy, and I don't think he's going to traverse those guardrails. Some other president may well.
Right, and to just extend that a little bit, just the election process itself. I mean, we now have a quite extensive template for disrespecting the outcome of elections.
Absolutely, and we have a Republican Party, the vast majority of which still believes that Joe Biden's election was illegitimate. The vast majority of Republicans in this country, 2/3, still believe that Joe Biden's election was illegitimate and that he is only there because of voter fraud. Now, that's ridiculous. There's no evidence for that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence, tremendous evidence, that it's completely untrue. Yet, we have a lot of Republicans that persist in that view. And that is, again, very damaging long-term to the country, because it does call into question the legitimacy of future elections as well.
Some Republicans, not in that 2/3 you mentioned, probably in the other third, recently have been talking about the establishment of a third party. And I know that's always a very interesting proposition in the classroom. I know very often students are very interested in the possibility of a third party. As a professional, do you see it as a viable option anytime in the foreseeable future?
No. I could go on. I could expand from that. Look, there's always been an interest in third parties in this country, and that interest sort of waxes and wanes, but it's always been substantial. It's never come to fruition. And the Republicans who are talking about a third party, some of them are Trump Republicans who think they're the third party. Some of them are more mainstream Republicans who think they're the third party. Maybe there's four, who knows how many parties there'll be. But the reality is there's something in political science called Duverger's law, which basically says if you have a first past the post system of representation geographically based, you're going to end up with two parties. And that pretty much is true. You end up with two parties in a system like ours. Canada has a third party, the UK has a third party, but those third parties are, for the most part, pretty small, and I would say relatively inconsequential, though their members may think they're quite consequential. But we also go one step further. We have laws that make it very difficult for those third parties to access the ballot, very difficult to access the ballot. And those current members of state legislatures who decide those rules, being almost all Democrats or Republicans, are not about to make it easier for those third parties to get in there and siphon off votes. And so I think it's very hard for third parties. Look, the other fact is this. There are people who argue, and I would tend to associate myself with this, but I'm not 100% sure of it. But there are certainly people who argue that Trump got elected in 2016 because of third party voters. And this election would seem to support that notion, because the reality is, as I said, Joe Biden got more, Donald Trump got more votes. So did Hillary Clinton, much higher turnout. But the reality is the vote for third parties went down substantially in this election. And most of that difference seems to have gone to Joe Biden. So the reality is that voting for a third party can help put someone like Donald Trump in office. So it's not necessarily a good thing. Obviously, if it's Republican splitting, I consider that a good thing, but it doesn't always work out so simply and so neatly.
I don't disagree with you, but one of the factors that in this country that's played into keeping it solidly a two-party system is that both parties have been able to evolve to deal with growing political movements, things, when environmentalism came along, most Western countries wound up with a Green Party. We wound up with Democrats, moving on environmental issues to absorb some of that strength. The circumstance we seem to be in right now is that one of the two parties, the Republicans, seem incapable of that kind of evolution.
No, that's very true. That is very true, and that's going to cause them over the long term significant problems. And they'll respond to it, I think, in one of two ways. They'll either change their policies and become more inclusive and more diverse and so on, or they'll shrink, and you could see another party develop. But what usually changes the Democrats or the Republicans is losing decisively. That's what really makes the change. And so far, neither party is losing decisively. If it gets to the point where the Republicans do lose decisively, I think we'll see that change. But look, between 2012 and 2016, I could on dozens of panels with Republicans who said, we will never make this mistake again. Romney, who now is a semi-hero to Democrats for voting to convict Trump. Mitt Romney talked about immigrants in this country self-deporting. And my Republican colleagues would get on panels and say, we're not doing that again. We understand that we need a party of diversity, that we need to welcome more immigrants. We had a official Republican National Committee autopsy of the election, and the only policy recommendation in that document was we have to get right on immigration reform and do some good immigration reform that it looks more diverse and welcoming and inclusive. And all the Republicans got started on that stage next to Donald Trump, taking that point of view. And by the time they got to the end, you had Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio arguing against their own bill, against their own immigration reform bill, because they had no way to stand up to Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and win a Republican primary. So the Republican Party is doing okay so far with this attitude. At some point, they may lose decisively. If and when they do, they'll rethink.
Mm-hmm. Is domestic terrorism taking hold as an important issue in our politics?
Well, it's an important issue, period. There's no question about that. The Department of Homeland Security, even under Trump, said that the biggest threat the country faces is from domestic extremism, domestic terrorism, domestic violence, violence by domestic groups. So there's no question it's a very serious issue. The question is, how are we going to combat it? And it's not, quite so easy as dropping some bombs, sending some troops, which is what our responses tended to be to international terrorism. So it'll be very interesting to see what the Biden administration does with this issue. I had the opportunity to spend some time with Secretary Mayorkas, our new Secretary of Homeland Security, a couple of weeks ago. He is very seized with this problem. He understands how serious it is. And it'll be very interesting to see what new approaches and new programs the Department of Homeland Security develops to deal with that domestic terrorism. The first thing that's going to happen, though, as I suggested before, is that these people who invaded the Capitol, these insurrectionists, are going to be caught, as they are now, and be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And that may or may not have a salutary effect. It'll be interesting to see how those cases proceed and what it does to the rest of those groups.
Well, the House Democrats have stripped Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee assignments. She's suddenly become very high profile, suddenly one of the best known Republican members of the Congress. And and only 11 Republicans voted with the Democrats. In the 2022 midterms, will Democrats seek to make her the face of the Republican Party? And if so, how do you see that playing out?
Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, we just got some new facts on this from the poll data. And what's interesting is that she is very well known among Democrats. She's much less well known among Republicans and independents.
Mhm.
So for a lot of this so far, we've been talking to ourselves. Democrats have been talking to ourselves about the evils of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I certainly agree with that. I think she should have been stripped of her committee. I think she should resign from the Congress. I wouldn't mind seeing her expelled from the Congress. But the reality is, so far, this is an issue that has seized Democrats. It's barely penetrated with Republicans and even with independents. But there is a broader sense here that the Republican Party is engaged in these conspiracy theories. She is by no means the only Republican member of Congress who is a conspiracy theorist. She's now the best known for sure, but we have others around the country, Burgess Owens in Utah, for example, but many others who have been, again, similarly engaged with these with the QAnon and other conspiracy theories. So there's clearly an attempt already. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is spending a significant amount of money on ads right now, trying to paint the Republican Party as the party of the conspiracy theories. The Republicans are helping us with that by protecting Marjorie Taylor Greene and protecting other conspiracy theorists. But whether that will be a major issue as we actually get to 2022 or not, remains to be seen. Hard to know.
Yeah. And going forward, she may help with that because, suddenly now able to raise large amounts of money, she's going to want to keep that. She's going to keep that pipeline flowing.
Exactly. So she can raise lots of money for herself, and she also can command a lot of attention from the news media. And so I expect that her name recognition is going to go up among Republicans and among independents as time goes on. And I would think that a lot of that's going to end up being negative, but again, remains to be seen.
President Biden's placed a great emphasis so far on reunifying the country and in wanting to reach out and work somewhat across the aisle to get things done. From your perspective, is there any hope for a return to some degree of bipartisanship, or is the political polarization in Washington just too strong? I shouldn't say in Washington. I should say in our politics in general, too strong.
I happen to be quite pessimistic about this myself. I don't think there's a lot of hope at least in the short term, even in the medium term, for return to what we used to call bipartisanship. I think that Joe Biden is reaching out to Republicans. I think that is very important for him politically. I think it's very important for the country. I don't think it's going to have, and I think that's an important effort to make to say that I'm the president of all the country, not just of the people that voted for me. And he's clearly articulating that over and over again. And I think that's very helpful and very useful. I don't think it's going to make a fundamental difference in terms of the level of bipartisanship. Why do I say that? Well, when I'm sure when you were in the Senate, when I first came to Washington, the saying that everybody left me with was, the aphorism was, there are no permanent friends, there's no permanent enemies. The people that are with you on this issue today are going to be against you tomorrow, and the people that are against you today are going to be with you tomorrow in some other issue. Because we had what, again, political scientists call cross-cutting cleavages. You may be a Democrat, but you may have been from the South or from the North, and that gave you something. You may have represented an agricultural area, you may have represented an urban area, all kinds of different cross-cutting cleavages. So people were moving around in their votes, and that is, members of Congress were moving around in their votes, and people are moving around in their votes. But we have become deeply mired in partisanship. The public has become much more partisan, and that means the Congress has become much more partisan. And the truth is, now, instead of seeing different people with you and against you on different issues, every time you look across that dividing line, you see the same people lined up against you and the same people lined up with you. And that just makes that line deeper and deeper and deeper. So it becomes a trench. And now it's a canyon.
Yeah.
It's a canyon separating Democrats and Republicans.
And it makes it easier to demonize people, which is the really the opposite of what the way most politics was conducted, as you suggest, when we first came to Washington several decades ago. I always think of the story of Joe Martin from Massachusetts, who was, I think, twice Speaker for 2 years and handed the gavel back and forth with Sam Rayburn a couple of times. And Sam Rayburn was asked whether he intended to go up to Massachusetts and campaign against Martin. And Sam Rayburn said, campaign against him? Hell, if I could, I'd vote for him. And somehow I just can't see Nancy Pelosi saying that about Kevin McCarthy. You know,
yeah, nor vice versa.
Yeah, that's right. Very much a different world.
Well, it's because these identities that we have, instead of being different and cross-cutting, are now mutually reinforcing. And so we just have one sense of identity here that all stacks up on each other, and that makes politics more Manichaean. That is, it's about good versus evil. That makes it easier to demonize the other people. The geographic concentration of parties, which has proceeded apace dramatically in this country, dramatically. Democrats live together, Republicans live together. The number of close counties has decreased. The number of counties that are landslides for each side has increased. Same true with the number of states. So people live together who are alike. And in a geographically based system like ours, that means that each of these people, each of these office holders, is honestly more worried about the primary from their left, if they're a Democrat, or from their right, if they're a Republican, than they are about the general election. You know, we used to talk about median voters, just sort of, you know, get that voter in the middle. That's the one everybody had to get, and that pushed everyone to the middle. Now we have a bimodal distribution, you know, that looks like 2 camel humps instead of 1. And that means you got to go to each side in much more dramatic fashion. So all of these different trends are coming together to make us a much more deeply divided society.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I just fear the implications of that for the future of democracy.
Yes,
I mean,
definitely. It's a problem.
Democracy presupposes that the people are going to be able to come to the table and negotiate with each other. And that appears to be problem number 1 right now in the Congress, is we just can't get the parties to the same table to negotiate.
Well, and look, these people who attack the Capitol are indicative of that problem. We didn't have this before, but we are so divided that there are people who think they can go to the Capitol of the United States and start killing members of Congress and the Vice President of the United States because they disagree with him. That it's an extreme, obviously. It's not what most Americans think, I don't think. But the reality is that reflects overall the much deeper divisions that we have in the country. And there's not, you know, the truth is, for the last, no, I shouldn't say for the last, from the end of World War II, well, from the beginning of World War II to the 80s, the 90s, we had an enemy overseas that was more important. First, it was the Nazis in World War II, but then it was the Soviets. And that Cold War gave us, you know, it was us versus them. We had an us and we had a them, but them were overseas and us were the folks who were here. Now we don't have a them overseas. We have an us and a them domestically. Mm-hmm. So us versus them, always there. The question is, who is us, who is them? And I don't see anybody replacing the Soviets or the Nazis as that overseas enemy. So, and I do see the attack back and forth in our own politics.
And who would have believed that we'd see the day when we had magnetometers outside of the doors to the House chamber
yes.
to make sure that members of Congress weren't carrying weapons on the floor.
Exactly. It's
So we've all watched the incredible rise of the Democrats in Georgia, first to carry the state for Biden and then to elect 2 U.S. senators. Can this be replicated elsewhere in the South, in your judgment?
It can eventually, but it really depends on the place. Look, what was the case in Georgia was that you had a very large number of African Americans who were essentially kept from participating in the process because they were not registered to vote, because it was made difficult for them to register to vote. And they didn't see politics as being relevant to their lives and so on. And you had some organizations, Stacey Abrams' organization, one of them, but the truth is you had organizations that have been working for decades in the field in Georgia to make some very specific changes. So for example, you had motor voter registration come into Georgia. That meant that a lot of people who had not been registered before got registered to vote. That's the first hurdle. You can't register and you can't vote in most states unless you're registered. And so that was the first hurdle. And it was made a very big difference. All of a sudden, you had a pool of people that you could work to pull out on election day who hadn't voted before because they weren't able, but now were able to. Second, you had organizing efforts. You had people spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort explaining to people, door to door, person to person, why it was important to be involved in the political process. And all of that organizing and all of those law changes made a real difference in Georgia and got us to what is still an essentially evenly divided state. And so can that be replicated in other places? You know, it depends on the size of the population on the one hand. It depends on the legal structure in those places, and it depends on the willingness of folks to invest in what's going on there. Look, and we also can't underestimate the changes in Georgia that were a result of Atlanta. Atlanta is a metropolitan city that has drawn people from all over the country to live in the South, but in Atlanta and in Atlanta suburbs. And that changed economy has made a difference. And the folks from the North have made a difference. And I have not seen data on this, but I will bet any amount of money that if you took out the people who from the electorate, the people who moved to Georgia in the last 15 years, people who moved to Atlanta in the last 15 years from the North, took them out of the population, neither Joe Biden, Warnock, nor Ossoff would have won. Those people played also an important role.
And on the other side of the coin, we see the response already in just the few months since the election from Republican-led legislatures around the country in the direction of voter suppression.
Exactly. There's no question that Republicans, I mean, they've said we have to pass laws to keep people from voting in myriad ways. And the truth is, not all of those laws have been totally successful, especially when they've been exposed for what they are. But they can have an effect. They do have an effect, and they are, as a conscious strategy, trying to pass those laws through states. And look, the geographic concentration here is a problem. Democrats can win, obviously can win the Senate in Georgia, can win the presidential race in Georgia. Those are done on a statewide basis. Might be able to win the governor's race in Georgia. Again, it's done on a statewide basis. But it will be a long time, a very long time, before Democrats win the state legislature in Georgia, because Democrats are highly concentrated in urban areas. Republicans are much more spread out. So the reality is Democrats would need to do a whole lot better in Georgia to capture the legislature. And that pattern replicates itself in state after state, with Republicans having real advantages in state legislatures where some of these laws can be passed.
A related question. Donald Trump worked real hard to discredit mail-in balloting, obviously. And so I think as a result of that, we saw a big divide between Democrats voting in large numbers by mail and Republicans not doing so. Do you think this is a somewhat permanent feature going forward, or did it work to Trump's disadvantage enough that we might see a readjustment of that in future elections?
Well, it'll be interesting to see if some of these Republican legislatures go back to trying to make it more difficult to vote by mail. It would be interesting to see if they do that. I think that's going to be hard. There's no question people like it. There's no question the states that have adopted it have seen increases in turnout, increases in participation as a result. And it's just a heck of a lot more convenient for the voter. And there is, as we all know, absolutely no evidence that this is subject to fraud or manipulation in any way. And, we know that Donald Trump votes by mail on a regular basis. So but we could see Republicans trying and legally make it more difficult to vote by mail. We'll see if that happens and if they're successful with that. We'll also, though, I think it will depend on what Republicans do in the next couple of elections. There's no question in this election, there was, as you say, a dramatic difference. Republicans were pretty unwilling to vote by mail. Democrats overwhelmingly did. But we'll see going forward, if we have Republican presidential candidates who encourage people to vote by mail, that will, I think, begin to change that attitude, but that may take a while.
Okay, we'll turn to audience questions in just a minute, but as a last question, I like to ask our guests who are very successful professionals, particularly in politics. I've learned that many of our students are interested in learning about how it is you got to where you are and what kind of advice that you have for others who might want to travel a similar path.
Well, honestly, my career has been fairly serendipitous. I was a graduate student and teaching political science, and somebody came to me and said, I'm an unknown legal aid lawyer. I want to run for Congress. I'm against an incumbent. I have no chance. Will you help me? I said, well, this is an interesting idea. I'm going to charge you $2,000 to do that. He came back and said, I'm not sure I really want to pay $2,000 for that. I said, well, that's what it costs. And eventually he agreed, we agreed. And we won a big upset in that year. And when a publication that you recall, but others don't, Congressional Quarterly, did a list of 115 competitive races that year. We were not on it, but we won anyway. So the next year we met. I did Carl Levin's race and Al Gore's race. So it was really very serendipitous. And we won by a relatively small margin. Had we lost, I probably would be, teaching at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh or something, and be a very different life. So it was very serendipitous. But I think to me, there are two pieces of this. There's education and there's experience. I think education is undervalued in the political realm, but I think there's a lot of things to learn, especially if you're going into a technical field like polling, understanding survey research and so on, very important. So learning what you can learn in college and graduate school, I think makes a difference. The other thing is experience. Get out there, work on campaigns, volunteer, get jobs on campaigns. That's the way most people in this business move and move up, is by working in campaigns, getting noticed for the fantastic work they do, often as volunteers first and then later as professionals, but working on those campaigns and being willing to travel around the country to do them tends to be one of the prerequisites for being successful.
Okay, let's go to the audience. I'm not sure this first one is actually a question, but Howard Schulman says, "Go Tigers."
Thank you.
That's a reference to Detroit?
No, I think it's a reference to Princeton.
Oh, okay, right. It shows you I had my blinders on.
It could be either.
Yeah.
Or to the World Wildlife Fund. I'm not sure.
Maria asks, how important was local organizing in the unexpectedness of this election? What advice would you give to students who wish to become organizers?
Well, so first of all, organizing definitely has an impact. There's no question, as I was mentioning before, we would not have won either the presidential race or the Senate races in Georgia without a substantial amount of local organizing. So can it make the difference in a close race? Absolutely it can, and has. When I talk about the kind of jobs that people can get in politics, those jobs as organizers are the beginning of almost everybody who goes through the process. You start off as a local organizer in a community for a campaign. I've done that myself. Other people have done that in campaigns. That is the paradigmatic entry level job. So it is for those who want to go into politics, it's critical to do it. And for those people who want to have an impact, it's also very important.
You may have touched on this one earlier, but Franklin asks, what are your thoughts on the split among Republicans over former President Trump's influence in the party? And how will that split impact 2022?
Well, we talked about it a bit. I mean, I would say this, there's no question that there is a split. There's no question it's in the Republicans' interest to heal that split. But to the extent that they heal that split by becoming more identified with Trump, it's problematic for them in some places. To the extent that they heal that split by becoming less identified with Trump, it's a problem for them in other places. And so it is a classic dilemma. Trump has left them damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Anne asks, I've come to rely on Alan Lichtman's presidential predictions. Do you consult with him?
I don't, honestly. I don't.
Yeah. Okay.
First, let me make 2 points.
Sure.
One is I'm more in the strategy business than the prediction business. The work that we do is, obviously we end up with a number and we're either winning or losing, and that's not trivial. But I consider myself to be in the strategy business, much more in the prediction business. So just finding out which presidential candidate is going to win is not that helpful to me. So that's one reason. Second, it's there are critiques of the method too. There's no method that's perfect, but he certainly illuminates a lot of areas that are important in presidential politics.
Thomas asks, have the epidemic of robocalls, scam calls influenced negatively the potential polling participants? Do you need to be more selective in selecting polling participants?
Why would you think that would have an impact? No, I'm just kidding. Yes, it's had a tremendous impact. It's one of the reasons people don't answer their phones, don't answer their landlines, don't answer their cell phones unless it's a number or person that they know. So yeah, there's been a big impact from all those kinds of efforts. And it's hurt the ability for us it's hurt those response rates that you mentioned, and I think in a fairly dramatic way. It's not really about us choosing the respondents carefully. It's about people being willing to talk to us, and they have made fewer people willing to talk to us, and that creates the problems we talked about at the outset.
Long-term, can polling keep up with today's globalization, extensive media coverage, and quick impact that events can have?
Yes, if it's done right, it can. I think the one thing that we should note, though, is that most events, most of the time, don't have very much impact as single events. So just something to keep in mind. Something can. We go to war. Other things happen. But somebody went through in, I think it was the 2016 election, and found like almost 300 things that were labeled as game changers by the press in the election. And the polling data suggested not one of them made any material difference in the election results at all. So we tend to exaggerate the impact of these events. But when they do happen, yes, polling can pick them up. I've done polls in cases, some of which I'd rather not discuss, but in cases where we've seen very dramatic impact, often in a negative way, on one politician or another as a result of events in the real world.
Howard asks, what is your response to the idea that polls are ruining elections by focusing campaigners on certain, usually very small parts of the electorate while totally ignoring the rest? Did Trump or Biden visit Rhode Island or Massachusetts or New York or Connecticut during the last election? Politicians need polls. TV stations looking to sell ads during broadcasts need polls. That's about it.
Okay, well, hopefully that's from my children. That's not a opinion that becomes widespread. But I would say this: you don't need polls. I mean, the Electoral College and history is what means that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden come to Rhode Island or Massachusetts in the closing days of a campaign, because the reality is clear. Rhode Island, Massachusetts are not swing states, and you don't need to do a poll to figure that out. You can look at the electoral history and you can see that they're not swing states. So, and it's that really drives the sort of the avoidance of certain places and the focus on others. Even if you ban polling, you'd end up with that same result. Now, what polling does is tell people what the right groups to focus on are if they want to win. That's one of the things that polling does, or can do, is focus people on the right people. So even before we had polling, we had people thinking about elections. Who do I want to talk to? What is the message I want to use? And they had other ways of trying to figure it out. They intuited it. They looked at past election returns. They sat on bar stools and talked to people and said, well, this is what most people think. Or reporters stood on a street corner and asked people what they thought and who they were. So we've always had ways of trying to figure out what the horse race is like, even before we had polls. Polls give us a more accurate way of figuring out where the horse race is, figuring out which groups are swing, which groups are less swing. But we've always tried, politicians have always tried to make those calculations. They just have a more scientific basis on which to do it now. And the truth is now we have a lot more data besides polls to be able to use to make those determinations.
Do you think the determinative factor in the U.S. Senate runoff elections in Georgia was Trump's convincing Republican voters that the election was rigged and so not worth participating in?
Well, when an election is that close, everything is dispositive.
Right.
That's just the reality. The reality is that, white evangelical Christians moved more towards the Democrats this time than they had in the past. That was enough to make the difference. We had more African-American participation than we had in past runoffs. That made the difference. Everything made the difference when it's that close. So there's certainly some evidence that there were meaningful evidence that there were Republicans who would normally participate in a runoff who didn't participate in this one. And presumably, importantly, that's because they were convinced that it was rigged. There's certainly some evidence of that, but that's only one of very many factors that in a close election produce a winner. Had that happened, but we not had the African-American turnout we had, they wouldn't have won. Again, you can go through all the different demographic groups, all the different voter groups, and say the same thing. Had this group not performed as well as it did, we wouldn't have won.
Yeah, as you say, often true of close races, we always seem to be in search for just exactly what was the key demographic that made the difference. And in races that are close, the answer to that is any number of different groups.
Correct. I mean, you can, there's two ways of looking at this. One is sort of statics. Where did people win? Where they get big margins? Where they lose by big margins? And there's dynamics. What changed over time? And those are not necessarily the same thing. Small changes can make a big difference, even when, masses of people are on one side or the other. A lot of what happened in Pennsylvania, for example, in flipping Pennsylvania from Trump to Biden was not Democrats, in some one place doing better. For example, people talk about Philadelphia. Democrats actually did less well in Philadelphia in terms of the margin. Joe Biden did less well in Philadelphia than Hillary Clinton did. But there's a lot of little factors in individual counties, relatively small changes in a pro-Biden direction that accumulated to give him a lead compared to where Hillary Clinton had been. But it wasn't one place. It wasn't one thing. It wasn't one group.
Do you believe we will continue to see an increase in the amount of people voting in elections?
No, I don't. Because people looked at this. I would be happy to be wrong. Let me be clear about that. I'd be happy to be wrong. I'd love to see more people continue to vote. But people tend to vote more when two things are true. when they think that they are part of a community that values the act of voting, when they feel that social pressure. That's perhaps the most important factor. And that, I think, is increasing. That is, more and more people are voting. As more and more people vote, as more and more people talk about the importance of voting, more and more people get the picture, get the impression that voting is valued, and that's important social pressure. But the other factor is the degree of importance people attach to this election. This election, last election, 2020, was sky high. The number of people who thought this was the most important election of our lifetime was higher than it has ever been. And honestly, I don't think it's going to be that way in the future, unless perhaps Trump runs again and wins the Republican nomination in 2024. Maybe we'll have a repeat. But absent that, I don't think people are going to attach quite the same level of importance to the next couple of elections as they attach to this one. And that might let turnout go down a bit.
Let me ask you a related question that comes to mind. For a very long time, the youngest cohort of voters has voted at a lower rate than older voters, and it's almost directly proportional as you go up as the various cohorts age. They tend to vote more often now, and we've seen an increase in youth voting in the last couple of elections. So I wanted to ask you about that. Would your answer be the same there? And secondly, since we have a lot of young people in our audience tonight, what would you say to them about this?
Vote is what I would say. Look, the reality is that we did have a higher participation of young people this time for sure, but still we had greater participation from older people than from younger people. So those differences are still there. They're muted a bit, but they're still there. There are a lot of young people who are very disconnected from politics. For example, people are very concerned about what's going on in their community, very concerned about what's going on in their lives and their neighbors' lives, who volunteer, who do all sorts of wonderful things. But even many of those people say, okay, that makes a difference. If I tutor somebody, if I help somebody in some way, I'm making a real difference. If I go to vote, it doesn't make any difference. This time, because of Trump, a lot of those people said, you know what? I do see the difference it makes. I do see the impact it has. Whether that's going to persist over time, I just don't know yet. I think it's too early to tell. But we do know that voting is a habitual behavior also. The more you do it, the more you're likely you are to do it in the future. And so the fact that some younger people started out voting in this election is a good sign. If we can get them to vote in the next one and the one after that, then chances are they'll really stay as voters for the long term. So it's going to be very important to focus attention on those young voters and make sure that the people who showed up last time show up again, as well as the new folks who's coming into the electorate. But establishing those habits is critical. And you establish those habits, again, by making it clear to people that what's happening in this election is important to their lives, important to the lives of people they care about. And second, by making it clear that you care that they vote. It matters to you whether they vote.
As you were talking, you reminded me of a story. When years ago, I worked for Paul Tsongas, and when he first ran for the Senate, he was in the first parade of the campaign season, and marching right behind him was Tip O'Neill, the former speaker, who many in our audience will remember. Tip kind of moved up behind him, put his arm around Paul's shoulders and said, let me give you a little advice. When you're out here on the parade, you see those people over on the side in lawn chairs? Well, you should always wave to them, go over towards them, shake their hands. So, because the kind of people who bring a folding chair to a parade are the kind of people that vote.
People that make plans ahead. Yeah. And that's why we talk about all the time in trying to turn people out, make a plan to vote. You probably heard that a million times during this election, because we know that people who make a plan to vote are more likely to do so, and the people who bring lawn chairs to parades are people who plan ahead on their own without being told to do so.
Good point. Thomas asks, is there really an Antifa? There have been no arrests from January 6th. How can Republicans continue to adopt this big lie?
Well, the same way they continue to adopt the big lie that the election was stolen.
Yeah.
This is a problem in our society, and it's a problem particularly in the far right in our society. There is a susceptibility to these conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact. There are studies that show that people on the left are just as susceptible to conspiracy theories, at least some kind of conspiracy theories. But these conspiracy theories, these very dangerous ones that are political in nature, tend to be, it seems to me, more focused on the right. And clearly evidence, facts, evidence, logic, reason has nothing to do with it. That's just not what they're focused on. These stories, these conspiracy theories help them deal with other problems in their lives, help them deal with other thoughts that they have. There's a psychological use for them that explains the world to them in a way that is congenial to them. But look, the other thing we have, and this goes back to the sort of polarization problem we were talking about before, when I was a kid, which is now quite some time ago, everybody, most people in the country, on any given night could be found in front of one of 3 television evening news broadcasts, where most people got most of their information. And those broadcasts were very homogenous. They were pretty much the same. At the time, you could pick out and say, oh, Walter Cronkite, he's a little bit more liberal than Chet Huntley. But by today's standards, you say there's no difference among these 3 different broadcasts. They're all the same. Certainly that's true by today's standards. We've had 2 things happen. We had some legal changes. Rush Limbaugh just died. It's relevant. We had legal changes and we had technological changes that combined to create a very different, very fractionated media. So we had in the 1980s, we had the FCC and the Reagan administration do away with the fairness rule. So you didn't have to give equal time to you didn't have to give fair time to the opposite opinion. So that created the possibility for radio hosts like Rush Limbaugh and talk radio to spew their own venom. And then you had a technological change, first with cable television and now with the internet. And so instead of having 3 evening broadcasts that everybody was watching, there's 140 cable channels and a million different places you can go on the internet to get news. And the result is you can find evidence of anything you want somewhere. And if you want to believe what OAN has to say or what Breitbart has to say, you can get that news all the time, any day you want. And you can avoid all the other news. And you can think that's true. So we had, again, it's psychological issues, there's technological issues, there's legal issues, all of which combine to make this a difficult problem. And I'll add one thing more. Sometimes there is a slight basis in fact for some of these things. So for example, when we did, right after the election, we did a series of focus groups and polls on this issue of this so-called election fraud. And people said, to us, my parents who are no longer living, they said, got ballots mailed to them. Okay, well, that's true. That doesn't mean anybody returned them. But that's enough. It's a kernel of information that people have to say, okay, there are people getting ballots who aren't real voters. So then someone comes along and says, more people voted than are alive in a particular place. Well, okay, that makes sense to me because my parents are dead and they got ballots. So it's entirely possible. So that means that there are dead people voting or people voting in the name of dead people. Now, the truth is, it's not true that more people voted than are alive or were registered. That wasn't true. And it was true that your parents may have gotten ballots, but you didn't return them. And most people whose dead parents got ballots didn't return them. And the truth is, they wouldn't have made that much difference anyway. So yet, from a kernel of truth, people can, with other information that they get, can build a much wider conspiracy theory.
And I would add one additional factor. It falls under your category of technological change, but the impact of social media, which creates allows the creation of large coherent groups built around, even some pretty fringe conspiracies, the sort of thing that we used to just sort of dismiss and say, well, this is just a few people, in their basements, mimeographing leaflets or something,
Exactly. I mean, we just saw this with GameStop. I mean, there's a lot of people who thought GameStop was a really good investment.
Exactly. This question is from an old colleague of mine on Capitol Hill. You may know Bob Carolla. Besides Trump, who might run for GOP nomination in 2024?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not prophetic, so I can't be sure, but
Right.
I will say there are a couple of people who are clearly positioning themselves. So we have to look at Nikki Haley and say she is positioning herself to run for president. That's why she left when she did from the UN, I think. It's why she's done a lot of the things that she's done. So I think you have to look at Nikki Haley and say she is a likely candidate, and she's an interesting candidate. Obviously female, obviously minority, obviously family of immigrants. So it's an interesting story for the Republican Party. Some of the usual the former cast of characters you have to think will be back. I don't think Ted Cruz, even despite his terrible judgment today, I don't think he's given up the dream of being president. I don't think Marco Rubio's given up the dream of being president, even though he performed so poorly on his last outing. So there are clearly some of the older the characters from 2016 that will, I think, be back. A lot of them were pretty young, and they'll be, still well young enough to be running in 2024. There'll also be some new people.
Which means they're under 90, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And there'll be some new people that we haven't even heard about yet or haven't thought about yet. And I can't say who they're going to be because we haven't thought about them yet. But there'll definitely be some names that we haven't even thought about at this moment that will be in such a race as well.
Let me just tack a question onto that. We like to think of presidential primaries in terms of lanes. You think is there a non-Trump lane in the Republican primaries?
Well, I happen to be a big enemy of lane theory of primaries myself. But having said that, there is Trump. And if Trump runs, Trump occupies the Trump lane, and everybody else is fighting over the rest. And the rest may be too small to fight over. That remains to be seen. But Trump will definitely occupy a Trump lane. Beyond that, I'm not sure that beyond Trump himself or one of his children, I'm not sure that there is a Trump lane per se. I think Trump is sort of a unique figure. I'm not sure anybody else can pull it off in quite the same way. I think there are other people that will try to be imitators, but I think they will divide up that Trump vote to a meaningful extent, and other people will be able to compete for it as well. Trump, what holds the Trump vote together is Trump.
I think we've got time to squeeze in one last question. Sure. This one's from Catherine. She asks, has polling shed any additional light on why people are willing to vote for Trump, despite his obvious flaws?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And the answer is yes. There are a lot of reasons. Let me put it this way. Trump really united three different strands of conservatism, one that had been sort of wholly submerged for a long time. If we think about conservatism, there is anti-government conservatism, which we've seen for a long time. That's typical Reagan, small government, get rid of the government kind of conservatism. Trump certainly represented that. Now, he was a little bit different. He was claimed to be for things like Social Security. He was for a larger stimulus check than the Congress and so on, the Republicans in Congress. But by and large, he was for winning, but for smaller government. And he brought those people together. The second group is people who are against change. I mean, that is the classic Burkean conservative, right? Is against change. And we have a lot of people in this country that felt that there was too much change going on in this country. A lot of us looked at that change and saw it as positive, but a lot of people looked at that change and saw it as negative. Before 2016, before the election, we did a poll. We found 55% of people saying that American culture had gotten worse since the 1950s. Now, I remind you, in the 1950s, we still had segregation in this country. We did not have color TV in this country. I mean, there's just, in a million different ways, you can say things have gotten better since the 1950s, but people thought things had gotten worse. Those are people who, and that was the importance of Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. Again was the most important word in that in some ways, because he's hearkening back to a world that never existed, but that exists in people's heads. And so they wanted to change back to some previous world. And look, that included a lot of people who felt they were dispossessed, people who thought they were economically central, culturally central, demographically important, and they have been dispossessed. They are no longer economically central. They're no longer politically potent, and so on. So there's a lot of people who thought that change was bad. And then finally, there's a conservatism that has been, that was before Trump, wasn't talked about very much. And that's based on an aversion to difference. So you have an aversion to government, you have an aversion to change, you have an aversion to difference. And that had been sort of subsumed in this country because we were increasingly recognized in the civil rights era that difference was something to be celebrated, something to be acknowledged. George Washington acknowledged that many years before the civil rights era. Obviously still was a slaveholder, but talked about the importance of moving beyond toleration to actually embracing differences. But there was that anti-difference group, people who thought that immigrants were bad, et cetera, were given a real life by Trump. And so he was able to bring those three sets of people together. People who didn't like change, people who didn't like government, people who didn't like difference. And that was it's a powerful coalition, and it's about half the country. Though I would emphasize, he didn't win the popular vote in 2016. He didn't win the popular vote this time. It's not a majority of the country, but it is a set of people in the country that are conveniently distributed from the point of view of the Electoral College. And that is the problem. And that's why, again, Biden was able to win, but by a very narrow margin in these states that determined the outcome of the Electoral College. And it's why we have a 50-50 Senate. It's why we have only a 5-seat majority in the House today. So the reality is the country is fairly evenly divided in these two camps. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Well, it was impressive that you answered the question without referring to a basket of deplorables.
I've tried to avoid that ever since.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for really illuminating performance tonight. And I wind up wishing that we could see the audience so that you could properly see all of them applauding at this point. But on their behalf, I want to thank you for spending time with us this evening, and hopefully maybe we'll get to do it again some other time in real live actual personhood.
I'd love that opportunity, Rich. Thanks so much. It's great to see you, and really a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Take care.